Do you want to, one of you, take a stab at just sort of telling us, just generally speaking, what is Meli and what's exciting about it?
Yeah, I can start with that. We developed a tool that enables beekeepers in the field to quickly diagnose a hive using sound recordings that are only 15 seconds, right? So you take your phone, you place it in the entrance of the colony, you record for 15 seconds. And with that recording in the field, without needing to be connected to the cell network, you are getting four key data points. So the first one is if there's a queen present in your colony. The second one is the amount of frames of bees, so grading/population. The third one, which we're very excited about, and a lot of our clients are as well, is the mite levels. And the last one is a bit more fuzzy, but it's like anomaly score, right? So is my hive an anomaly compared to the rest of my colonies? So these four data points we strongly believe will help in a bunch of different ways. So the first one being to just like be a good support decision tool in the field on for the workers and making them more autonomous and making sure that the data that they're collecting is non-biased and non-standardized. And it's not, workers have different levels of experience. They might have had a good day or a bad day. So they might go through the colony quickly. And sometimes, like on grading, for example, their grading might differ from like plus or minus 2 or 3 frames of bees between different workers. Doing queen checks, when you're opening up a colony, some of our beekeepers estimate that you've got like a 2 to 5% chance of killing the queen across your operation when you're doing queen checks and simply opening the hive. So having a non-invasive way to measure those data points is pretty key. Then finally, just the speed of it when it comes to sampling for mites. Right now, let's say with the most used method, which would be mite washes, takes you at minimum about 5 minutes per colony to perform your mite wash, and you're killing bees, but let's like keep it on the labor end of things. Now, if you end up using that same time but doing 15-second recordings across the hives in your field, it just enables you to scale your sampling to almost like 100% of your operation, if not 100% if you want to.
And so one of the, just to bring back to this theme of sort of standardization and learning from customers. So Meli is in beta right now. And so one of the ways that it's being used is to talk, it's like a model that's improving over time through data collection. Do you want to speak to like how that process works and how Nectar's sort of incorporating some of that feedback from actual field experience?
Sure. So one of the promise of Nectar is that the tool will be adaptable to the reality of your operation based on, if you're in Eastern or Western Canada versus, south of the United States and on the West Coast or the East Coast, if you're a pollinator versus a honey producer versus a queen producer. So I think we've done a pretty good job at building a tool that's flexible. And that was important for us when we're providing AI models to our beekeepers and tools that are based off AI, that the AI is adaptable to different sorts of contexts, right? So in the way that we built Meli, we knew that the model would be exposed to different sorts of queen genetics, different sorts of hive boxes in terms of equipment, your recordings in regions where it might be more hot, more humid, et cetera. So the model would have to constantly learn about that new context. So we built into the interface ways for the beekeepers in the field to be able to challenge the results provided by the model. A bit like if you were on Tinder, not that I have a extensive experience with Tinder, but it's a bit of a, I agree, I disagree, swipe left, swipe right in terms of the results that I'm seeing. So this way you're challenging the results and you are therefore providing the model with more insights on actually the recording that you just did was not 6 frames of bees, that was 8. So the next time that you're showing up and AI is seeing the same sound pattern, then it's going to learn and adapt from it. And we've seen like a few operations that have gone through that process of like, they're testing Meli for the first time. It's accurate, but not perfect. And then over the course of a few days or a few weeks, they're seeing improvements, like meaningful improvements in the field of how the model is learning from their context. So
Okay, so Marc, I'm really interested in one of the things you said, which is the ability to go from like doing maybe not randomized sampling, but sampling certain parts of your field to the ability to potentially sample your entire operation. How do you think that type of shift not only impacts like a beekeeper's capacity to understand their bee health, but just sort of the way that beekeepers are operating and planning and the type of outcomes they can expect?
Yeah, I'll take a few steps back here in terms of where we started or why we started Meli, and then kind of what we were seeing and why we decided to go into this direction. We know that mites are probably the largest threat that beekeepers have been facing for the past 20 years now, if not more. And it's the main reason of colony mortality across Canada and the US, and probably across the world. And when we were speaking with beekeepers, we were seeing shortcomings in the way that you can manage mite levels at scale, given that mites are endemic. So every colony will probably have some level of them, and that's an assumption you can make. But not every colony needs to be treated, at any given moment. And yet, because of the current sampling methods, that in best case scenarios, we see 15 to 20% of the hives of a beekeeper being sampled on a regular basis, but that's really like exceptional. In most cases, we're talking about like 2 to 5% of the hives being sampled. So what we were seeing in terms of status quo was simply people doing blanket applications of treatments throughout the season at key moments, especially like in the spring and the fall. And that leads to high cost in terms of inputs, in terms of labor, and also like resistance building over time. And we're seeing some of the products that are traditionally being used being less effective nowadays. At the same time, in our database, we were seeing millions of recordings of like data points around feedings and supplements and mite treatments, but not a lot of mite readings. So when we investigated the situation, we saw that the method of capture of mite levels was limited. So that's why we decided to go into a method that would enable a unbiased way to do it at scale. Now, the question is what do you do once you've got that scalable data on mites? What was great during our client interviews of when we came up with Meli, and we brought it up to a few of our clients that we collaborate very closely with, and a few of them immediately brought the idea of integrating IPM programs within their operation. So the ability to sample 100% of their mites provides them an extremely granular view of their mite levels across the operation, which means that instead of doing blanket applications of treatments, now you can start treating mite bombs and highly infested colonies as they're showing up in the field, which we're hoping to see happen starting the season. We know that a few of our beekeepers are going to start experimenting with that, and having that very granular view of hive health across your operation, not just on mites, but on queen status and on grading, and seeing the trends over time, we believe will unlock more decisions when it comes to, transporting hives to specific pollination contracts and treating with different sorts of products and using specific queens. So we're excited about that expanded granularity.
Yeah. And I would jump in there and suggest that element we've kind of proven out even without Meli. So some of our most satisfied clients are already the ones that have bought into the idea of something closer to regular hive level data entry and kind of observation, such that they can, via their manager's portal insights dashboard, get that kind of macro view of bee health across yards, across genetics, across parts of their operation, to triage important scenarios and make decisions on where to go and what to do to keep healthier bees. So those operations that are already operating that way with that level of depth, they've already bought into the importance of granular hive level data informing this macro level overview of their operation. And what Meli allows is for everybody else to be able to get to that level of granularity much faster. And I think we'll get into the evaluation of kind of performance of the model and assessment of what we think is good enough. But if we discuss mites for a moment, I think that's where we get to something where what we're competing with is something relatively unreliable in the form of the alcohol wash. And so not only does Meli allow beekeepers to build this granular data set that they can zoom out and get an overview of their operation, but you're also doing that with a model that we believe can be significantly more performant than alcohol washes, where, a sampling mechanism that I think many beekeepers don't have all that much trust in.
Yeah, so would you say, a term that I've heard that we've used at Nectar a number of times is this idea of precision beekeeping. And it describes this sort of shift of moving away from like blanket treatments towards more targeted interventions. How would you say that Meli sort of fits into that larger vision of how that exists across different beekeepers' operations?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll start by saying I think it depends on the beekeeper and the context, but I think there's a spectrum, and it can range between, I think as it pertains to mites specifically, our vision is very clear, and it's a vision of IPM where.
Do you want to just tell us what IPM is? Just
integrated pest management, essentially the idea that only the hives that require treatment are receiving treatment. And so I think as it pertains to varroa management, our, I'll say, kind of medium and long run goal is to support beekeepers in making that possible, right? That is something that a hobbyist may find to be a possible alternative, whereas a commercial beekeeper, given the structure of operations, may not find that possible. And with non-invasive, fast, and reliable diagnostics, we believe that can and will become the norm. Now, I think there are other areas where Meli can still support blanket management decisions. For example, frames of simply having the average frames of bees per yard at a distance may support the kind of general decision of from which yard am I going to send a crew out to source hives from for pollination, for example, which isn't necessarily driving an individual hive level decision on field, but instead a kind of general management decision across the operation.
I think generally speaking, from a strategical perspective, when we're looking at our product roadmap and the abilities that a tool like Meli provides us in terms of helping beekeepers, it's also kind of going away from that defensive mindset that a lot of beekeepers might fall into when they're being reactive to a lot of the issues that they're facing throughout the season. And the hope and the vision with a tool like this is, and generally speaking, precision beekeeping, is to help them to be as much as possible as proactive as they can when we can see some of the issues arise. So treating mite bombs as we're seeing them in the field is one example of that, but also seeing the grading trends of different yards, improving or going down over time is, other data points that we think we can help beekeepers be a bit more on the offense.
For sure. And I think that ties into a sort of a larger discussion of the role of AI at Nectar, which is that, obviously the technology has really evolved. And one of the sort of really profound things about Nectar is its ability to collect such enormous volumes of data. How do you think about the problems that AI is solving for beekeepers at Nectar? And how do you think that sort of with the other sort of AI tools that maybe you can describe a little bit, how does that sort of change the shape of beekeeping work generally?
Yeah, our philosophy around AI has been to see it as a scalpel and, use it, or like a scalpel, like a tool in your toolbox, I should say, right? So it's not going to be the silver bullet that's going to solve everything in beekeeping. It's there as one of the tools that Nectar can provide beekeepers to enhance their ability to perform their work, whether you're an apiary worker in the field or you're the foreman in the office or in the truck that has to make like higher level decisions. So we are very intentional in terms of like how we're building AI and what type of models we're using. So in both Meli and the new tool that we released that projects longevity, it's our own models that we built. We don't use off-the-shelf stuff that we don't know if it's going to be performing in an industry like beekeeping. And in a biological context, it's very specific to bees, right? So internally, when we build AI models, they need to be biologically coherent, and that's the way that we've structured our own team when we've built kind of our AI department. So in terms of improving the way that beekeepers work, or at least changing it, again, to me, it's about being proactive and being able to make better decisions in the field. That sounds a bit general, but it's like it can then be, there's a bunch of different ways that it can manifest, whether we're talking about like having to replace queens when you're seeing that your introduction of a queen last time you were there when you're making nukes like didn't perform using a tool like Meli. Like that's gonna help workers in the field to make that decision faster instead of like not being sure. Maybe you're losing precious minutes in the field, or you're skipping completely a visit where you could have reintroduced a queen if you had them on you. Same thing for treatment. Same thing for a colony that might have made grade, but your worker, had a bad day and was a bit pessimistic around its strains of bees when you looked at the colony, and now you've got something that's unbiased. So that's helping you in all of those like micro decisions that when you compound them at the end of the season, ended up making a huge change for the operation.
For sure. Are there anything, would you say that, so a lot of the things that you're mentioning are they're sort of tactical. You're describing it as a scalpel. So like subtle interventions, it's a tool in the toolbox. Are there any things that AI is enabling beekeepers to do that they absolutely could not have ever done before?
For me, I think that the speed of Meli for mites, now we're getting down to, in the past, there are other mechanisms and methods, I should say, of measuring mites, but there simply are not methods for measuring mites at a speed that is financially viable, that makes financially viable the scale of each individual colony. Another one, so we have rolled out projected longevity. So it is a feature that projects the number of colonies that will be alive at a future date. And again, this is a model that factors in many of the different data points across an operation, which simply would not be possible. So I'll push that one step further. That model can be further supported by the use of Meli. So scenario where we're overwintering indoors and the beehives are not accessible, and Meli is actually used on those to collect 15-second audio clips on the hives in those buildings, then improves the performance of the model because we're now closer to the end of winter, and further, this is a date at which normally a beekeeper would not have access to their bees to see the state of their bee health, thus permitting a best possible projection of hives alive for pollination, and thus allowing a beekeeper ahead of schedule to, if they project to be long, take on additional contracts. If they project to be short, get support from other beekeepers on their existing contracts.
And what the longevity prediction model and what that tool does in the product, which I think is another example to your question of like what AI enables, is measuring the effects of typically what's not measurable by humans, right? So things like air quality and the quantifying the amount of vegetation in every yard that your hives have visited, and computing the effects of mileage when you're transporting colonies between different states. Like these are all things that at the scale of commercial beekeeping, and argue generally speaking, air quality at large is extremely difficult or impossible to measure when you're managing your operations and have to make decisions on, should I be sending colonies from X yard versus Y yard to that pollination contracts? And the longevity projection model takes those metrics into account. So based on the GPS coordinate, we are able to pull a lot of third-party data, such as what type of weather the bees were exposed to, which is something that right now beekeepers would typically know, a lot of rain, snow, was it cold, was it warm, etc. Doing that scale is harder, but air quality we're seeing is having a strong impact on bee health, and that's something that's simply not accessible right now to a human. So being able to measure the intangible when you're making decisions is something that is, I would say, like net new in terms of abilities, thanks to AI in this case.
Yeah, I'll actually extend that even further by suggesting that, you know, a farmer has 50, 60 goes in their life where they'll get to do each practice once a year for however many years they're growing, or in this case, growing bees. And so a lot of their kind of underlying models, which might be written somewhere or might live somewhere in the back of their brain. So based on the way my bees look here right now in September, I roughly project that I'll have such and such number of hives by the early part of next season. That's largely going to be based on their sample size, which is just significantly smaller than Nectar's and more difficult for an individual to process. So our models are built off not only the number of years that said client has worked with Nectar, but also all of the users of Nectar. And so what that means is that if, for example, a beekeeper has never been exposed to one variable, such as let's use the wildfire example, right? A beekeeper is in a location where typically they're not exposed to wildfire. So they don't have a mental model for what they might expect their survivorship impact to be from wildfire. That being said, within the Nectar data set, many beekeepers have been exposed to wildfire, and the way that we see that is by increased AQI scores. And so even though it might be the first time that beekeeper X is exposed to wildfire, the model has been trained on the impact of wildfire, and thus a beekeeper can actually benefit from that scale that AI and Nectar's data set make possible.